Are you ready if I start my little spiel?
Oh, no, if you want to start right at 1:30, then sure, go ahead.
I'll let people come in. I have kind of a long, speech. Okay, who's in the chat here? All right. Welcome, everyone. Tanji Kakiao Kiawao. Today, we gather virtually together from many different places. It is a real gift for us to be together in this way. We gather virtually on this land we call Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 territory. Treaty 1 was signed only 24 years before Dalnavert Museum, Dalnavert the House, was built in 1895. This area of Turtle Island is the original lands of the Anishinaabe Cree, Oji Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and is the homeland of a nation that I am a proud member of, the Métis Nation. This is the 6th installment of the Elizabeth Alloway Lecture Series. Dalnavert Museum is honored to host this series in collaboration with the Winnipeg Foundation's Centennial Institute. And in celebration of Elizabeth Alloway, and to shine a spotlight on the shared Elizabeth Alloway History Scholarship Fund and Heritage Friends of Dalnavert Fund, which, if you're willing, you can donate to on the Winnipeg Foundation website. I encourage you all to do this. It's a $7,500 annual award, which will support a second-year master's student in researching how women have shaped the history of Canada and understanding the roles of women in Canadian history. It's very important. So this is a joint fund with Dalnavert, so supporting the scholarship fund will also support the museum as well. This fund is named for Elizabeth Alloway, who, along with her husband, William, were instrumental in starting and establishing the Winnipeg Foundation in 1921. When Elizabeth died in 1926, she left her entire estate to the foundation, which was over $800,000, which in 1921 was a lot of money. She was deeply interested and committed to charitable work, especially when it came to the welfare of children and women, and she was very interested in the career of nursing. She was an excellent host and lived just down the street from her friends McDonald's and Dalnavert at what they called the Dorries on Assiniboine. So I'm going to transition now to introducing our speaker for today, and welcoming Laura Forsythe, who is a University of Winnipeg tenure-track lecturer in the Faculty of Education and a PhD candidate in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. And she was the Métis Inclusion Coordinator there. Her research focuses on how Métis assert educational sovereignty at campuses throughout the homeland. Laura's contributions to the academic world and to the Métis Nation are numerous, and among them, the creation of a Michif language program at the University of Manitoba that I have had the privilege to be a part of and had continued, and I still am interested in Michif, speaking Michif language today. And she has sat on the Louis Riel Institute Board of Directors, is a delegate for the Métis Education and Training Local Advisory Committee, and established the MMF Bison Local, which is my local, at the U of M. I mean, there was tons more I could talk about for Laura, but I'm going to end there and introduce Laura Forsythe. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Charlene. I was just mentioning how amazing it was that time has flown by. We talked about this so very long ago, and here we are all together today, which is incredible. So you bear with me for just a moment. I'll get up my screen, and we'll get started. All right, so right now you should be looking at our overview of the time we're going to spend together. And so thank you, Charlene, for that beautiful territorial acknowledgement. And because so many of us in this room are so passionate about Michif, I'm going to say it one more time in Michif so those of you can hear it. So, dans le Michif, le terrain de Nikinak de Egwa, dans les Anishinabeg, le Cri, le Oji-Cri, le Sioux, puis le Dene, Nishtem, le Pi, the campus, the University of Winnipeg, Ashtiwa. So as you heard, I come from the University of Winnipeg. Now I've come across the river. I also want to acknowledge that the power that we're using today here for me to be with you is coming from Treaty 5 territory, and the water I'll drink in my tea comes from Shoal Lake First Nation. So today, you'll see this screen if you want to follow along, feel like how long more is this woman going to talk at me? You'll see it here because this will keep popping up as we get through the 6 sections that I hope to talk about today. So the first one is like, who am I? And like, why am I even invited to come and talk about this when there's so many other people who could speak on it? And so Laura Forsythe, my name, as you heard, is Laura Forsythe, and my family, Kwayesh, Rooster Town, Oshiwak. So a long time ago, my family was from Rooster Town. Anosh, my family, is in Winnipeg. So today my family lives in Winnipeg, and my parenti, or my ancestors, in case we might be related, are Hoopy, Ward, Burrard, Morin, and Sear. So I am Michif, or Métis, from the Red River Settlement, and I grew up here in the heartland of the Métis homeland. And so now, like the generations of women before me, so I'm really passionate about this scholarship, and I'll have to find out more about how I can support it, because my maternal great-great-grandmother, or great-grandmother, Nora Burrard, was born at Rooster Town on land known as Lot 31 by my ancestor, Jean-Baptiste Burrard. And my lineage includes Joseph Hoopy, who fought at the Victory of Frog Plain, which some of you may know as the Battle of Seven Oaks. And my maternal great-great-grandmother, Sarah Morin, came to Rooster Town from another Métis based in the Turtle Mountains. So I'm sharing this with you to say, like, okay, this is why the museum has asked me to come and talk about my lived experience within what's happening at Rooster Town today, and also what my ancestors' experience would have been in the past. So as she mentioned, not only am I just a part of the nation and a local citizen from the Bison Local, but I'm also an elected official there as an executive, and have the pleasure of this week calling all of our local members, which has been such a real fun and an exciting time. And so, having co-founded that local, I'm working as hard as I can to help support Métis people, and as a descendant of Rooster Town, going to all the consultations that I can around what will be done for the future of the descendants and those people who actually live there who are alive today. All right. Now, as she mentioned, so I do a little bit of research and a little bit of things. So all things Métis, really. So I research Métis women and politics, Métis women and the institution, Rooster Town after Peters. So we'll talk a little bit about what does that mean. And then, of course, Métis women's contributions to the academy. Now, when you ask a Métis person where they're from, or when a Métis person introduces themselves, they may give you a ton of names of everyone, not just their last name or their grandmother's last name, but maybe 4 generations or 5 generations of names. And the reason that they're able to recite that is because many citizens, certainly those of MMF, have a blue book. Mine happens to be blue, and a lot of people got a blue duotang, so we call it the blue book. And within that, it's created by the St. Boniface Historical Society, and it will outline at least 16 generations of your family. So, and where they come from. And on numerous lines of my family, we know our 16th and 17th grandparents leading all the way to the 1400s. And so this is how I know who my people are, even if I don't know their story. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how could you know who you're related to, but not know what they experienced. So let's move on to how are the Burrards dispossessed in the 19th century, and then we'll go into a collective dispossession in the 20th century of Métis people on the very same property. So here is a map that outlines all of the parishes that are here in Winnipeg. So this looks very familiar, I'm sure, to anyone coming to us from Winnipeg. You're like, oh yeah, this I know this place. I know this place. And so Evelyn Peters, who wrote the book, Rooster Town, wrote this of the families I'm going to talk about today. So of all the Fort Rouge Métis families, the Berard's records are the most complete, and out of all the neighborhood farmers, Jean-Baptiste Berard received the highest price for his lot. Therefore, the experiences of the extended Berard family demonstrate the kinds of challenges that the Métis faced and similarly raise questions about estimated returns of the Métis on the river lot sales. Now, the Berard story also contradicts the views at the time that contending that the Métis were unable to cope with modern urban economy, and it suggests that there's a more structural explanation. Okay, and so we're going to see through this story multiple things that are going to be layered onto why Métis people are not necessarily in spaces that their ancestors would have been if nothing had taken them away from it. So Jean-Baptiste Berard and his kin for a long time farmed in the area annexed to the city in Winnipeg in 1882. So his father, Louis, was a carpenter, and he also owned the land of Lot 31 in the 1830s. Now, Louis, he gets married, everyone gets married, they have tons of children. All of these families are now living on this particular lot. It was 149 acres. So to put that very simply, my family at one time owned 149 acres along where the Grand Park Mall is. Okay, so this is important to remember as I continue to tell this story. So, and he had a wife. Jean-Baptiste is married to Helen. They have 4 sons. Everyone's having tons of children and living prosperously on this land, farming and practicing the trade, most of them of carpentry. Now, unfortunately for the Métis, there are 2 things that are going to happen in a 10-year period. And so in 1881, at the beginning of the Fort Rouge real estate boom. And for us that live in Winnipeg, we know how populated Fort Rouge is. It's hard to imagine that at this time, it's really open fields run by families in on lots from the river. Like there's nobody out there. But all of a sudden, as any time we have a sprawl happen, people are starting to build outside of where we're seeing that right now on all sides of the perimeter. We have this huge boom in real estate. So this also happened in 1881, and Jean-Baptiste sold a parcel of land for $8,000. And later that year, he sold another parcel of land. You're thinking, this guy is rolling in it. In 1883, Jean-Baptiste made 2 more sales. So they have these sales being indicated that they're happening around this land. Keeping in mind he had 149 acres, so there was land to certainly sell. But according to the assessment rules, in 1883, so only 2 years later, the Berards retained only 30 acres of the land originally in Lot 31. And at that time, there was trade happening. A tradesman would have earned in 1881 $1.75 a day. So, not very much. So the recorded sales around what happened to this property represented basically an astonishing 53 years of wages. Okay, so they should have had 53 years of wages. The probability is from the records that they've found through these sales is that the Berards did not actually receive the amounts recorded on the property abstracts. And so in 1891, the census still listed Baptiste Berard, so Jean-Baptiste, as a farmer in the area, and that there was a 10-member family occupying a small 2-room house. I just told you that he is rolling in dough. So how could he now be here in this little teeny tiny house with his entire family? And so Peters and her team tried to uncover what possibly could have happened. And their only conclusion was that although the statement said one price, that they were actually paid a very different price. Now, if you're interested in that kind of research, research around taxes, research around purchasing prices, David Parent has an exceptional dissertation he just released that details how Métis people were removed from their land using these kind of tactics. Now, another thing happens at this time that displaces them even further. So many of you may have heard, and some of you may have never heard of what Scrip is. And so Scrip was introduced, and although it was supposed to be introduced to ensure that families, Métis families who lived on lots would be able to remain there. That is the sort of, when we talk about how did we go into these agreements, how did these things get made, what was the intention? The intention was to ensure that all Métis people who signed these would be able to stay with their families all together and be happy and healthy, even though there was an influx of settlers coming to the area. Well, unfortunately, changes made with the government in sections 31 and 32 of Manitoba in the Manitoba Act, which were supposed to guarantee that land, they were used not as intended. And what actually ends up happening is that people would be given monies or given land that was essentially useless to them. If you lived by 20 members of your family in this happy, healthy place, whether you had a great community, you loved working with everyone, everyone's children had grown up together, and all of a sudden, all 5 families were being, repositioned throughout places in Manitoba that didn't necessarily have the greatest farmland. And you're like, but I'm on this farmland. We have lived here for 75 years. Like, this is a great place. And they said, no, that's not your place anymore. Your place is somewhere else. Well, when that happened, they had the option to say, I don't really want that land. That land is useless to me. I'll take the $160, right? In hopes to secure the land you're already on, or that you as a 5 families could find land somewhere else, trying to maneuver to stay together. So many Métis families signed these documents with the government. And so Scrip would be issued for land in a manner that broke up the communities, as I've said, and it paid no attention to the lot system. It became a checkerboard system, which we now see. If you see an aerial of Manitoba and you see a green field and a yellow field and an orange field, that sort of squares is what the new system put in place by the federal government was to look like, and was determined by those coming from Ontario, and it benefited those coming from Ontario. So this is Joseph Hoopy's papers that were signed, saying that he would no longer claim being basically an Indian and had no rights. And then here is Helen's, the wife of Jean-Baptiste, signing this document as well. If you're really passionate about learning more about this, Jennifer Adese on Facebook, on the MMF Bison Local Facebook, has an incredible tape lecture about how Scrip was manipulated to cheat children, to cheat women, and essentially to cheat men as well from land and from their intergenerational wealth they should have acquired. So that would be one to check out too. There are so many issues with Scrip that I can't really detail them today because we came here to talk about a certain lot that was put up for Scrip. This is the bills you would have gotten if they offered you land you didn't want. Now, as we saw this in the Scrip section of my family's land housed in Rooster Town, meaning my family owned the land in which the Pan Am pool resides, and today many of my family members live in rentals, and some of them in the North End. And we're going to talk a little bit about how does that happen? How do we go from being a pecan town surrounded by generations of family to dispersed throughout Winnipeg, no longer having intergenerational wealth? So we have phase 1 of dispossession of Métis people, of all Métis people, is the Scrip system, which many of your families, if you are Métis, have experienced, and you can look up their Scrip documents on a website, which is really exciting. So if you want to do that, find out more about that, stay out after, and I'll share the link with you. And it gives rise to now phase 2, which is the sort of collective dispossession of people in the land we specifically came to talk about today. So here is a visual of what the Burrard family looked like in 1906. We've already heard stories of Jean-Baptiste and Helen, and now here are their children and their children's wives and who their children had, and this sort of cascading of families that are born in this place. And who live in very close proximity to each other. So the Burrards stayed on a portion of Lot 31 that was not signed away with Scrip and was not sold, those 30 acres, for several more years. But by 1890, we're seeing that this city assessment rolls show that the Burrards, who remember should have had tons of money, no longer have enough money to pay for their tax. And it is now owned by the real estate loan company. So it's likely, as I said before, that the exchange of monies wasn't actually the listed property abstract price. And so there's this huge lack of demand in Fort Rouge and high taxes being placed. So they stopped paying taxes and the city transferred the land to a real estate company to sell. And they remained on this land now as squatters. So here is the book that you can all buy if you haven't bought it already. It's by Evelyn Peters and her research assistants, Matthew Stock and Adrian. And this is where this gets really interesting. I told you that we know the names of the people in which we are descended, but not necessarily their story. And so my great-grandmother, Nora, lived in Rooster Town. She was born there. Her family for generations had lived there. And here I was a person born in the 20th century that didn't know that. I had no idea that my great-grandmother had lived there, that she ever graced that space or that any generation had ever lived there. And so for me, this particular book has a piece of my heart because when I was in a lecture, kind of like this one, Evelyn Peters was there talking about her new book. She was a research chair and an urban social geographer, and she revealed to me that I was a descendant of Rooster Town and my family's history, of which I had no previous knowledge. Like, I was shocked to hear the erasure, the racism, the discrimination, and of Métis resilience that was the lived experience of my ancestors. Indeed, this was a history stolen from our memories. The shame associated with having lived in Rooster Town, as propagated by mainstream media, which we'll talk about in Winnipeg, led my great-grandmother to never speak of the place she was born. I mean, it's shocking, really, to think that you would, and many of you who are Métis, or many of you who know people who are Métis, they'll say, oh, well, we just found out that we're Métis. And you may question, how is that possible? Well, this is how this is possible. It is possible by shame coming associated from the discrimination faced for years, if not generations, and then you just stop talking about it, right? And it gets lost to you. So now there's, hope for personal enlightenment when this book came out drove many community members to the launch of the book, all anticipating that their family trees and pieces of their lost history would surface between its pages. Through this study, our entire living lineage was introduced to history far beyond anything that a family tree could have provided, or the photographs left by ancestors could communicate. I mean, in featuring our family and many other genealogies, which we'll talk about, Peters and her research team over a 4-year period have participated in recreating, reclaiming, and reframing the narrative that we will tell our grandchildren. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend this book for you. Now, the final blow to my family living in Rooster Town comes before the mall is even an idea. And that comes through another sort of sad piece of Métis history, and that is with veterans. So Peter Burrard the son of all these generations you just saw, went and fought in the First World War. So born in 1877 at Rooster Town, or at that time was still Jean-Baptiste Lot 31 land prior to the sale. He was 40 years old, and he served in the 101st and 43rd Battalions, but he was struck with pleurisy, which is an inflammation of the lungs caused by pneumonia, which many soldiers experienced in the First World War. And he was hospitalized for 2 months and then given 3 months' pay of allowance and discharged. Now, unlike other soldiers who were settler soldiers, that was all he was given. There was no land, there was no further medical expenses. He was sent home, unable to work, and infirmed, really. The medical board estimate of the impact said that he would be able to make a full livelihood once he had been discharged, so they would not have to pay him. But unfortunately, he died in 1934 after years of being ill, and it says on his in the obituary that his death was due to service. So his family received nothing, like many Métis veterans, and were forced to move away from Rooster Town to seek support from family, and so that Sarah Morin could go and work out of town to support all of her children. And so if you're interested in learning more about the Métis experience in terms of veterans in both the First and Second World War, you can check out the Métis Veterans Legacy Program. The website is up there, stories that the nation has told about what has happened, what has transpired, and why it's as important as it is for us to be paying for our veterans. So our story in my line ends at that moment. We went from owning 149 acres to then owning 30 acres to then losing them to the tax. And then even as squatters could no longer afford to live there because of my great-great-grandfather not being supported by Veteran Services or by Canada after he served in 2 different battalions and was a war hero. So now let's talk a little bit. I've peppered a little bit about Rooster Town. As you saw, Rooster Town started after my family was living there. So the book starts the story in 1900. So let's go there. So with the Berards moved away from this place, we now have a different story. So here's a document provided by Burley in 2013 and is also featured in the book. And it just shows sort of what are the streets. Now, if you're imagining that Rooster Town, I don't know, was lean-tos or some sort of teepees in the fields, that's absolutely incorrect. These are houses on streets that remain today. Houses that remain today. We're talking about the 1960s. We're not talking about 300 years ago. So I want to put that in everyone's mind. And that's why I'm saying, where did they live and who lived there with this document here? Because if you're from here, you recognize these streets and they're still here today. So now Burley has a great article that was written in 2013, as I said, and it stated that over its lifetime, Rooster Town and its residents became increasingly marginalized, and it became less of a transitional community and more of a locale for last resort and refuge from all of those other displacements I'm talking about in the late 1800s, where people were being moved and shoved, and they found themselves locating there because several generations were living in that space and could provide the community needed to support each other. So there were rather large families, so I'm going to show you that in a little while. Now, a significant number of they had left their locations that are unknown to come to that place. So now the first generations of families that moved in South Winnipeg in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were probably better off than those who lived there in the 1930s. Remembering the Depression comes in the 30s and everyone was sort of wiped out by it. Now, the Canadian Northern Railway was hiring for its Fort Rouge car shops and yards and construction crews. Although there was a lot of working class immigrants and Canadians acquired housings along Pembina Highway close to the rail yards, many of the folks living at Rooster Town were also employed there. These are working families living in real houses, had real jobs. Let's put that in our minds. So how many? Now, it's hard to imagine how populated the area is because of this document that you're looking at right now. Is that little circle is where we're talking about, and obviously it doesn't have the density of the core or the density of the north end at this time, but there are quite a few people in this space. Now, the shopping mall is announced. Now, I want you to keep in mind the timeline of what I'm telling you. The shopping mall is announced 6 years before they spoke to anyone from Rooster Town. Okay, so it's announced, it's in the newspaper, people are pumped, right? Kind of equate it to when they talked about rebuilding Portage Place. Like it's in the newspaper, it's in the news, everyone's kind of talking about it, and they're excited because they don't understand who is actually even living there, because if you're not by it, you don't even know it exists. But there's an order of removal. So here's a picture of order of removal. And thanks to Daryl, who I'll talk about later, but this is in his application, which I'll also talk about later, that we have an actual copy of the order of removal in 1959. Again, 6 years after, when they're like, hey, what are we going to do? And then they say, we're going to build this incredible mall. Oh, there's a problem. There's people already living there. Well, we'll get rid of them. This is how. So similar to when we remove people from the corners of downtown, this is a very similar removal that happens. They go there, they ask everyone essentially to get out. Now, in this particular order, they just said, oh, we'll give you some money. Now, the eviction, and here are the spots and the things that are currently in this space, that little circle that I showed you. This is now what's currently there. So we have the Pan Am Park, Pan Am Pool, we have Grant Park Mall, we have the Grant Park High School. That is sort of the space that we're talking about. Now, the eviction of Rooster Town's residents and the burning of their houses erased the remnants of the Métis community that had existed in the South Winnipeg since before Manitoba entered Confederation. Okay, now the area south of the Assiniboine River had long been divided into these narrow strips, which I talked about, and occupied seasonally and year-round individuals and Métis people that were displaced from other lands. With the federal government failing to provide land under the Manitoba Act, they just continued. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many Métis folks, and they could be in this talk today, that moved west, went to Saskatchewan, had that experience, went to Alberta, went all the way to of course, British Columbia, up in the mountains. But we're going to talk about the people who stayed here, the people who stayed here. Now, here is the $75 offer that's individuals received. And through the 1950s, commercial and residential development intensified in South Winnipeg, and the developers were seeking to assemble land for new housing. And of course, all those I just mentioned. And they received sympathetic hearings from the municipal government that wanted to reduce the inventory of land seized for non-payment of taxes. So the land became too valuable at this time to be left to Métis squatters. So if we're thinking about a timeline, this land was taken in 1891, and it is now the 1950s, and people are like, wait a minute, they can't stay here anymore. I don't know if any of you are, up on how squatters' rights work, but definitely 60 years reaches the limit of when you get to stay. Okay, so I am going to share with you now a video that my sister made. It's the digital story of Rooster Town that she made for one of her classes that tells about the human story of this. Now, it worked in the practice. I'm going to put that out there, and we'll see what happens now.
Rooster Town, also known as Pankin Town, was a Métis road allowance community that existed on the outskirts of Winnipeg from 1901 to 1961. At its peak, it housed 59 families and a population of 250 people.
Laura, the video is not
Some
showing.
families called Rooster Town home for 3.
Okay, give me a second. We're going to stop sharing and start sharing a different video. Thank you, my mother. Okay. Okay, just 1 second.
Actually, I could see it.
Can you see it?
The other time when somebody said that they couldn't see it, I could see it. Just for
see it?
your information. Okay.
Okay.
I could see it for a second. Now we can't see it again.
Okay, just a second. This is your break.
Okay.
This is what we call intermission.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna try to do something wild and go back to it. All right.
We see it.
You can see the
We
video?
can't hear it, but we see
Okay.
it.
Is it playing?
Rooster Town, also
Yes.
Could you hear it?
Yes.
It was playing? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
also known as Pankintown, was a Métis road allowance community that existed on the outskirts of Winnipeg from 1901 to 1961. At its peak, it housed 59 families and a population of 250 people. Some families called Rooster Town home for 3 generations. Much of Rooster Town's housing started out as simple 1- and 2-room structures, and over time, additions were made. These houses were said to rise out of the tall prairie grass. Due to pressure from the city to relocate, Rooster Town residents were forced to move to Winnipeg's north end, where houses were more affordable. Many families were heartbroken at the loss of their Rooster Town homes. Most lost social support networks, as well as the strength and sense of community that came from living with other Métis families. Some lost employment opportunities with nearby businesses. All lost access to low-cost housing. Winnipeg newspapers of the 1950s focused on Rooster Town houses, depicting the community as a poor slum full of squatters. Even as recently as the mid-2010 articles state, the community consisted largely of shanties. However, this is not true. Former residents, like my family, lived in houses, largely self-built, and ranged from single-room dwellings to multi-room homes. A few are still standing in the Grant Park area today. In 1959, the city of Winnipeg ordered the houses of Rooster Town be torn down and its residents evicted to make way for Grant Park Mall, Grant Park School, and the expanding neighborhood of Fort Rouge. Rooster Town residents were consistently criticized in local media during the lead-up to this eviction. The media campaign of stigmatization inaccurately and unfairly portrayed the character and lifestyle of the people in the community, while working to justify their removal. It propagated harmful stereotypes, contributing to public support for the unjust displacement of Métis people from their homes. Moreover, the articles blamed their poverty and marginalization on their lack of ambition, that Rooster Town residents were satisfied with their situation. Notably, these claims broadcasted colonial attitudes of indigeneity and their aversion to successful Métis communities. Peters articulates, using self-interested colonial reasoning, John Defoe described Rooster Town as a threat because suburban development was encroaching on the community. Despite these attempts to ostracize the Métis residents of Rooster Town within daily newspaper reports, it is apparent that the failure to acknowledge a colonial history of dispossession inhibited non-Métis people's abilities to perceive the viability and cultural hub that was Rooster Town. The relatively untold testimonies of Métis residents reflect the positive aspects of Rooster Town. Métis and non-Métis people alike recognize fiddling, jigging, partying, visiting, and supporting one another as a common social practice in the community.
Laura,
Conversely,
just
newspapers
to interrupt,
broadcasted
what's
the
happening
negative
is
aspects of Rooster
you're
Town
not getting
gatherings
any
as these
movement
cultural
of the
and
video.
community-based
You're only
activities
getting
were
the
not of
voice.
interest to reporters.
And on the first
The act of
time, you
neglecting
had,
these realities of Rooster
video
Town and its
moving.
residents from the media
So
suggests
all
one
we're
of the city's
seeing is
attempts
one
to
picture,
other
the
the
very
Métis
first
and
one.
eradicate
Yeah,
indigeneity.
it's stuck on the map.
Within these communities, work, family, and social
very
ties
first
combined,
action,
developing
it was
into kinship
working.
ties that stretched across generations.
Back to where you were at the very first. I think what was happening is some people's computers weren't catching up to the video, so they thought it wasn't working. That's my interpretation. Yeah, I do a lot of Zoom, and that happens. So your very first one was working, where you had both voice.
Well,
and
then we'll
video.
really count that as our intermission because you couldn't see anything. Okay.
We could though. It was just a case of each person catching up with their computers.
Okay. Currently, can you see grass or can you see a map?
Grass.
Grass. Okay.
It
This is
played for a
very
minute
good.
and then it stopped on the map.
Okay. So you currently cannot see grass?
Now we can see grass. I can see grass.
Okay. I'm trying to get consensus on the grass business. Okay, let's see.
Grass.
Is it moving grass?
Slowly
Moving
moving.
grass.
Slowly moving.
Okay. Here we go.
And it says Rooster Town. You're on
All
the road.
right.
Also known as Pankintown, was a Métis
Here we
road
go.
allowance community
Here, now you'll see
that
the video.
existed on the outskirts
Okay,
of
that
Winnipeg
changed.
from 1901 to 1961. At its peak, it housed 59 families and a population of 250.
That
Yeah, no,
changed.
it's not.
Some families called Rooster Town home for 3 generations. Much of Rooster Town's housing started out as simple 1- and 2-room structures, and over time, additions were made. These houses were said to rise out of the tall prairie grass. Due to pressure from the city to relocate, Rooster Town residents were forced to move to Winnipeg's north end, where houses were more affordable. Many families were heartbroken at the loss of their Rooster Town homes. Most lost social support networks, as well as the strength and sense of community that came from living with other Métis families. Some lost employment opportunities with nearby businesses. All lost access to low-cost housing. Winnipeg newspapers of the 1950s focused on Rooster Town houses, depicting the community as a poor slum full of squatters. Even as recently as the mid-2010 articles state, the community consisted largely of shanties. However, this is not true. Former residents, like my family, lived in houses, largely self-built, and ranged from single-room dwellings to multi-room homes. A few are still standing in the Grant Park area today. In 1959, the city of Winnipeg ordered the houses of Rooster Town be torn down and its residents evicted to make way for Grant Park Mall, Grant Park School, and the expanding neighborhood of Fort Rouge. Rooster Town residents were consistently criticized in local media during the lead-up to this eviction. The media campaign of stigmatization inaccurately and unfairly portrayed the character and lifestyle of the people in the community, while working to justify their removal. It propagated harmful stereotypes, contributing to public support for the unjust displacement of Métis people from their homes. Moreover, the articles blamed their poverty and marginalization on their lack of ambition, that Rooster Town residents were satisfied with their situation. Notably, these claims broadcasted colonial attitudes of indigeneity and their aversion to successful Métis communities. Peters articulates, using self-interested colonial reasoning, John Defoe described Rooster Town as a threat because suburban development was encroaching on the community. Despite these attempts to ostracize the Métis residents of Rooster Town within daily newspaper reports, it is apparent that the failure to acknowledge a colonial history of dispossession inhibited non-Métis people's abilities to perceive the viability and cultural hub that was Rooster Town. The relatively untold testimonies of Métis residents reflect the positive aspects of Rooster Town. Métis and non-Métis people alike recognize fiddling, jigging, partying, visiting, and supporting one another as a common social practice in the community. Conversely, newspapers broadcasted the negative aspects of Rooster Town gatherings, as these cultural and community-based activities were not of interest to reporters. The act of neglecting these realities of Rooster Town and its residents from the media suggests one of the city's attempts to other the Métis and eradicate indigeneity. Within these communities, work, family, and social ties combined, developing into kinship ties that stretched across generations. These kinship connections, social and work contexts that developed into familial relationships and friendships, created a vital network of mutual economic and emotional support. In this tight-knit community, a knock at the door was always greeted with a welcoming call, a place to sit, promptly followed by the kettle being put on for tea.
Perfect. All right. So we all got to see the video. We got to hear it. We got to see it. Oh, how fantastic. All right. So my sister, Sarah Foster, made that for one of her classes that she is in at the University of Winnipeg. Oh, no, I go to the University of Winnipeg now. She's at University of Manitoba. All right, so I'm going to attempt now. You should be looking at colors. Is that true? Is
Yes,
it a
I see
colorful
colors.
screen?
True.
Okay, fantastic. All right. And now we're going to go and we're going to talk a little bit about, well, what about civic reconciliation? What does that look like? Because this has happened. We all know this happened now. We've all talked about it happening. So now that it has happened, let's see, I don't want this anymore. Let's move. Now it'll play it. You imagine? Let's not even go with it. We won't even go there. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about what is the city doing now? What have they done? And what does that look like? And is it enough? So Brian Bowman's favorite part. That's what we're going to go into right now. Okay, so when I click this, why does this video keep coming up, people? It's taunting me. There we go. Can you now see a thing that says 1, 2, 3, 4?
Yes.
Ah, fantastic. We're back on track, people. We're back on track. All right, so let's talk a little bit about civic reconciliation. We currently here in the Winnipeg area, our city is run by, of course, a mayor, like all other cities, I guess, but our mayor is Métis. So under his direction, various things have been happening under his tenure. And so let's talk a little bit about those. So we did see this featured in the video. So one of the ways that the city is approaching reconciliation with the people from Rooster Town and their descendants is through acknowledgement. So, and in consultation, I will say that as well. One of the really interesting things that has come out of reconciliation with the city and with Evelyn Peters. So without Peters, there is no city reconciliation. I'll tell you that right now. The outpouring of interest and people scooping this book up and talking about this story led to what we now see. She was also with Laurie Barkwell, the late Laurie Barkwell, trying to find families and put them together. So since that's happened, we've had a series of consultations and opportunities to meet each other, which has been really exciting, but also work on projects like these. So here we have a rapid transit in the back. For those of you who aren't from Winnipeg, this is what one of them looks like. And we had an art contest and which some of the residents were on the committee to help choosing. And Ian August won. And so his art installation was created, was here. It's called the Rooster Town Kettle. Another piece that was created and just recently opened through reconciliation is Commemoration. So the second part of Commemoration for the city is through Commemoration. And so they created the Bill and Helen Norrie Library. So what's interesting about this, I'm very excited about all the things that are here that we can see with our eyes right now that have been put in place to commemorate the land in which it's on, and those who stop to actually hear the story or look at the piece within the library get to learn a little bit more. On the ends of the bookshelves, there are also pieces and of literature that get to teach you little parts about what that is. But as I've pointed out here for all of you, it's still called the Bill and Helen Norrie Library, which for me, in a time of reconciliation that we're at in 2021, I find pretty distasteful. I think that naming it after municipal government, who at the time would have displaced and been in favor of displacing the very people that are on the wall, is probably not the way we should have gone. It should have been the Rooster Town Library, right? I think that we could have gone that step farther and not named it after a mayor. So that's the one part that I have. And the thing is about reconciliation is you're not going to make everyone happy. Some other folks may be tickled pink that this is on the wall and happy with the Bill and Helen Norrie Library name, but I'm a dreamer. I want to dream big. So now, at the time of naming this and building this, there was no plan to name anything after Rooster Town. So I'm going to say that first before I click to my next slide. Now, this here is also available on the website and at the library to tell you a little bit about why the images were chosen and the significance that they have to the people who live there. So if you are gung-ho to learn about this particular art installation and commemoration, this is all available to you quite easily on their website. Now, I had used the word Pecan Town, and it's called Rooster Town, and so that's a story all amongst itself. But folks who lived there at the time had called it Pecan Town because of the hazelnut bushes that were surrounding the areas, which the Métis families would have used, and so that's represented here on the mural. There's also houses, and what I love about the inclusion of these houses is that it now actually owns up to the fact that the story they told Winnipeggers is not essentially true. The train tracks, because everyone knows where the train tracks are, they're pretty important. And so you have all those things, and we talked about the kettle. Daryl is here, which is the son of Frank, and Frank used to be, and if Frank's here, I'm sorry I didn't see you come in. He used to deliver water in the area because it didn't have city services. And so that water cart is there, which is so incredible. So here are the families that are on the wall. Now you gotta choose families, I guess. And so they did, and they only have so much wall, and it's fantastic that mine happens to be there. But I'm gonna show you what the genealogy looks like now, and also say that they're continually adding to it as the Louis Riel Institute combines more and more and collects more and more people who live there. So here is a visual representation. If we were in, museum, we could have been all looking at this incredible document, but we can't because we're not in a museum, and it would be really hard for me to show you on Zoom. But here is sort of a smaller version of showing you all the various families and the generations that lived in this place and this space prior to having to leave, right? And so we have this, and that's fantastic, but this is what it actually looked like, folks. This is what actually it looked like in terms of who was in the space. Now, like I just said, at the time of naming the library, there was no talk of naming anything Rooster Town. And I have been to many of the consultations, that wasn't a thing. But thankfully, a citizen of the Métis Nation and a descendant of Rooster Town residents, his father Frank, as I said, Daryl put together this application. So what we're looking at is if anybody can make an application to request something, a name change. We are seeing quite a few of them here in Winnipeg. But Daryl put this together and wanted to rename the Pan Am Pool Park to be the Rooster Town Park. No brainer, right? I mean, so he put together this petition. Of course, in a time of COVID, I appreciate everything takes a little bit longer. And one of the hopes and the dreams of Daryl's family was to have this park renamed in time to, have a celebration, have a picnic. Okay. And this particular application received more, according to Daryl, received more interest and more commentary, because you can go and comment on all the changes that are potentially going to be made, than any other before, which is super exciting. And the picnic happened, okay? So the other piece is sort of education. So we have acknowledgement, commemoration, and education. Those are the three pillars of City of Winnipeg reconciliation. And so the picnic happened just recently, August 29th. And here we have the president reading one of the Rooster Town books. And here's our Métis mayor, Brian Bowman, up there at the front chatting about the place and the space that they are and welcoming everyone there. And it was titled Remembering the Residents. But unfortunately, because of the city having to meet and, do the whole thing that we all have to do when we want to do things, it didn't happen in time for this renaming. But it's on, it's coming up. It's on the horizon, which is really exciting. This particular picnic, there was a few pieces about it that I did find very interesting. One, that it was co-sponsored between the MMF and not just the City of Winnipeg. I think they owed that to the people they removed from the land to give them a couple of sandwiches for free. And it was organized by Rooster Town descendants, largely, in that room. And Daryl was there, many of us were there, and a few of our ministers and associate ministers, and one City of Winnipeg representative. So we can get to a whole debate about what does reconciliation look like. To me, having to do a lot of that work and heavy lifting in post-secondary, I know it should be done by more allies than just representatives of that nation, whatever that might be. And so I was a little disheartened, but I hear that the picnic was fantastic, that it was well attended. People were excited. They were there buying the books and bringing pieces of themselves, essentially, to add to this genealogy I just talked about. So it's in no way, done deal. I mean, there's still things to be found and to be said and stories to be told, because the book comes from a very academic place where it's deep into the archives and the city rules. But I think there's an opportunity there to have families share their voices, tell their stories, share their photos that weren't necessarily included in the first one. So there's definitely, I think, a sequel somewhere on the horizon. So let's talk a little bit about the future. What does that look like? Because, if you're thinking, Laura, they didn't say sorry. Oh, that's right. And if the third pillar is education, what have they done to educate? Evelyn Peters has a book. The library now has a couple of pieces up. The nation certainly has increased its awareness and telling stories and including in the Métis. But what has the city done? What has the province done in terms of education, specifically from the Ministry of Education? Well, spoiler alert, it's not very much. Okay, so now, one of the things that allies have done, so allies, not necessarily residents, in their classrooms at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Adele Perry, who's incredible, has a history class, and she had 10 groups create ideas around what does commemoration look like and what can it be. And so this one group, obviously they didn't make this coin, everyone. Don't get that excited. It's a small group of students at the University of Manitoba, but they did have an idea that, well, we could create a commemorative coin. It would have the names of individuals there. Maybe it would have a water carton in there. And they talked about the symbolic nature of creating that coin and the impact it could have on families and Canada to recognize that this has happened. And there were 9 other projects like it, and they're posted to the Press website. You can look it up. They're there in full detail. They're pretty beautiful. They put a lot of time and effort, and it's just sort of wrapping the minds around students' minds around what does it look like, and even acknowledging that this happened in a city not far from where they're studying. So I really applaud Dr. Perry for bringing that into her class. Okay. So what I did say is they didn't say sorry yet. So they've done all this other stuff, but not actually said the words that we apologize that this happened to you. And some people, when we went to this meeting in December of 2020, didn't feel that there needed to be an apology. They felt that it was in the past and they needed to move beyond it. And then there were other folks in that class, no, looks like a Zoom class, in that Zoom meeting that were like, no, we would like an acknowledgement. If you're going to acknowledge, there's Daryl and Frank. If you're going to acknowledge what has happened and what wrongs were done, then you need to say them out loud. And yes, actions speak better, larger than words. People say that, but words are really meaningful to people as well. So that was 10 months ago or 9 months ago. We're now here in September. I personally haven't been invited to any other meetings. That doesn't mean that they're not happening. It could be in full swing and motion. I look forward to hearing more about it, but as of yet, not on the table. And I do think I personally am on the side of the fence that says, yes, I would want in writing an apology said to the world, put in the free press, all that kind of fun stuff. I like the words as well as the action. The other thing that I think that we need is education. This is a beating by my mother, who's here today as well. Education is an unmet aspect of reconciliation. But why is it important? Well, we have people going to University of Manitoba, some classes going to the Grand Park High School that have no idea where they are, what land they're on, the stories that land holds, right? And some at Grand Park High School, of course, have had the privilege to have incredible educators that do put that into their syllabus, that do have that assignment that everyone has to do and to learn about and to create a beautiful, I know in the past they've created murals or art pieces, art exhibits within the hallways of Grant Park, but that's individuals, teachers, educators taking that upon themselves because there is no Manitoba-wide curriculum that includes Rooster Town that I have seen or can find yet, right? Yet is the important piece there. Now, and with that, I think that, there definitely needs to be a team. And it's not just, we have a lot of Indigenous students in Winnipeg 1. This has to be a citywide, if not province-wide, where we create meaningful curriculum with members of the community that live there and descendants, and with educators in a really exciting and dynamic way. Because I'll tell you what, I teach Indigenous studies, and when you talk about the place that people live, they perk up. They want to know what happened in their place so that they can go on and tell that story at dinner time. And so it's really important, I hope, with any ability that I have, that I can start this process now that I'm at the Faculty of Education, and to work with my colleagues and with the school divisions so that this story is being told in all classrooms. Now, another piece that's been happening that you may or may not have heard of, depending if you're from here, depending on how closely you watch the news, but Parker Wetlands, there was a blockade. Now, the Parker Wetlands is a little bit off from where Rooster Town was, but we can all assume they walked across the street, right, and went into the wetlands to hunt, to find berries, to just spend time, Obviously things were happening. And so Jenna Vandel here in the center, right where the word "this is treaty land" is, organized a blockade a few years ago when they wanted to clear this land. Now, obviously, we're looking at a photo where all the land is cleared, so it was cleared. But they tried their best. And the reason that education is so important to me is because if everyone who lived in this area knew the history of Rooster Town, knew the history of the Métis people in this space, then they would have gotten engaged and involved more in the clearing of this land. This cleared acres of land, so many that the city actually took the developer to court. Unfortunately, that didn't work out either. But if everyone was aware of what happened, they would not have wanted to wipe that land clean and put a giant condo on it, right? And so this is sort of what rolls out of not knowing, continually not knowing who lived there and how the land was used. So to give you an idea, what the Parker lands, it's a huge area, cleared of all things. Any Métis archaeology that could have been done in that space in terms of trying to find artifacts and evidence of Métis people using this space was wiped clean by bulldozers. Now, as I said, there are 6 divisions here in Winnipeg, 6 school divisions, which desperately need to tell this story. Why? I'll tell you why. I also teach Métis in Canada, and we often have to tell the story of Métis people in 1885, in 1870, dispossession and road allowance in the early 1900s. We never hear a story. We don't get a time to tell the story about dispossessions that happened in the 60s across the homeland using various nefarious tax situations. There are stories from Alberta where families were evicted for a tax bill of $100 and the land was sold for $25 to a settler. Like, these are the stories that we need to tell about the 1970s, about the 1960s to our children and to our Métis children, so they have an understanding of what their people experienced after Louisville. So I'm super passionate, obviously, about this, and I hope to be able to do further work in this area. So what does the way forward look like for me as an educator at the university level, but as a descendant of Rooster Town, is that I know how powerful hearing the story of my ancestor listed in my blue book, an ancestor my mother had tons of stories about, but never could share anything of this particular history. I think that there's something that we need to unlock for the future generations about their people. When students come to me shameful that they only found out at the age of 19 that they were Métis, they don't understand why. And I think that what we need to do is to tell these contemporary stories about how our relatives and ancestors were treated, to why that might be that they hid for as long as they hid. I mean, they call the Métis people hiding in plain sight, right? Because we're here, you can see us, we're throughout all industries, throughout all cities, but people never spoke of it. And so we've got to do something to turn that around. And for those who've come forward, for those who have shared, have been shared with that they are Métis, we need to tell them stories beyond 1970, 1971, because there is such a rich history and they can continue to understand their own way forward of how it is about reconnecting. It is about reclaiming. It is not about shame. It's not about continued discrimination because they didn't know who they were. We've done that too long. So we really need to embrace individuals, both settlers, allies, non-Indigenous people, whatever you want to call them, as well as Métis people, to teach them the stories about the places we drive by every day. So that's all I have. I apologize for the extra 3 minutes I stole from you, but now you will definitely know what my sister said twice. If you want to reach out to me, ask me any questions. If you're interested in any of the resources I kind of mentioned, but you're like, wow, she talks too fast, I don't know where to find that, you can email me, and then ask me any question you like, and I will give you the answer. I can send you the link, all that kind of fun stuff. So Kichi Marci, so thank you very much for allowing me to come and talk about something that I am so very passionate. And I guess we'll open the floor to questions, but I'm going to stop sharing. So I'll just give this a second, take a sip of my tea if anyone's writing it down. It's easy. It's my name and where I work.
Merci, Laura. Wah wah. Thank you so much for it was excellent. And actually, we will open up for question period now. So if you have a question but you don't want to ask it directly, you can put it in the chat, and I'll share it out loud. If you want to just raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask Laura directly, that's fine too. But I just want to start by saying I think we're related, Laura.
This is what we do. This is what we do. That's why we say so many names at the campus. What we used to do is have a kinship discovery day where everyone would bring their book and they try to find who they were related to. So I'm sure that your sister probably came. I do know Charlene's sister. She probably came, and your name is her name is next to mine on a bubble for sure. So that's awesome.
Yep. I was like, oh, wait a minute, those are my ancestors. That's so funny. Great. So we're just getting some thank you, beautiful presentations, informative, awesome information, a wonderful video. And Laura, you can send those links to me and I can send an email to everyone who participated and everyone can have access to that information. Jackie says that she's not a direct descendant, but has connections that they wrote about on their blog, hugirardin.wordpress.com. Wants to look up that. Very cool. Does anyone have a question that they want to ask? That was very thorough, so I don't know. We might just need a second. How important? Okay, so this one's from Giles. How important was Professor David Burley's early work on Rooster Town?
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting article. It's very topical. I think one of the things that David does is he studies more than one community. So it's kind of this surface exploration. You will find that there's an overlap of many of the visuals. I mean, there's only so many visuals in the work done by Peters. But what's really interesting is about the way publishing works is, well, long story short, it takes years to have something published. So although you've already been presenting on something and you've been sharing with something, it takes, a couple years to get to that published book. And Peter's team had been for, I think, 4 or 5 years researching this project and working with the nation and kind of presenting on this. So I'm not sure who saw what first and who influenced who first. I couldn't answer that. But definitely if you want just like a real short hit of knowledge, that piece by David Burley is awesome. I do assign it to my students in the class. They read it alongside of Rooster Town. It's kind of in case they don't read the whole book of Rooster Town, at least they'll get that. They'll know what I want them to know in a short period of time. But they're really, really good to read in together. Yeah, great question. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Giles. And if you're waving your hand, I can't see everybody at the moment. So maybe if you find your unmute button, click unmute if you have a question you want to ask out loud. Otherwise, chat is fine.
I think one of the things that you'll find, like when you do look at the Burley article, is he lists a series of communities that very similar things happen to. And there's a book called Settler Limits. It's also by the UM Press, and it has various articles in it, but so it's accessible. You can buy it anywhere. But it talks about different times and spaces within cities that Indigenous people, not specifically just Métis, can, you know what I mean? Like that have been dispossessed. But yeah, and again, I mean, I'm really excited to see the future work of David Parent. He just finished his dissertation and he's really excited to tell stories about how tax displaced Métis folks in the early 1900s. And so as that work comes out, I think we're going to see all sorts of communities. His dissertation work is specifically in the Interlake. So it's not just a big city thing, it's a small city thing, it's a rural thing as well.
Yeah, I would be interested to know, and I'll get to your question in a second, Jay, but Dalnavert was built in 1895 and Hugh John bought it around them, but he bought it, the person who had the land claim before was Onesime Falcon, who was a Métis man. And that's all we know. So I would be interested to get information on how that occurred or whether they were paid or what, just more information about that sort of thing. So it'd be good to look into that. Okay, so Jay says, are there any resources you think would work best directed at high school audience? And then
Oh, Jade,
Yeah.
no. I mean, no. I mean, that's the issue that we're having, right? There's definitely resources that you as an educator could then take and then make, right? But that's a lot of labor, especially you have a lot to do. And so it's my hope within the next year that we do have that and that we are able to share that. So a year from now, when you get an email from Charlene. So it is something that's definitely on the very forefront of my mind, but to my knowledge, no. And I work at the National Center for, collaboration on Indigenous education. So if it had existed free for educators, I would have seen it. And so it's definitely something I'm going to be keeping my eye out for. I know that incredible educators like Shirley DeLorme Russell, when she was working at, Grant Park, that's something that she was working on and developing and working in her class with. So she's definitely someone that I would be like, hey, Shirley, like, what do you got going already? What can we share with community? What can we share? So it's definitely, thanks, a great question.
So we had someone post a link for a book, Settler City Limits. And Virginia says that we moved to Oxford Street 50 years ago this month and knew nothing of Rooster Town until the Free Press article about Evelyn Peters' work. And she says it is important to revive understanding of this history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what's really interesting, and I don't like to talk about the negative stuff. That's why I let Sarah do it, because I want to tell the story of community and a story of resilience and a story of moving forward. But definitely the Free Press certainly had really some negative things to say about Indigenous people. And even in that new article that they wrote in 2010 was really largely negative. So it's, they certainly haven't done any atonement for the harms that they did in the 50s and the 60s and then continue to do in the 2010s. But you're absolutely right. When mainstream media tells stories, people can see it. I mean, that's the big thing. And so, when we put in the Free Press that this was going to be happening, people were then very excited to see it. And many of you maybe had saw it there. So it is important when mainstream media talks about things like this.
Yes, for everyone who needs to know, we will, this lecture has been recorded, so will be posted on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and watch anything or send it to someone that you think would be interested. So we'll have that accessible to everyone as well in the email that I will send with all of the links that Laura will send to me, which is great. Does anyone have any more anything else to share? Otherwise, I think we will let Laura drink her tea. Or maybe, do you want to stay on for a few minutes if people have?
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, if someone wants to chit chat outside of the tape lecture, then absolutely, yeah, stay on and I can answer any of your questions. Thanks so much for spending your Sunday with me. I was like, oh, Sunday, all right. I'm used to teaching 19-year-olds. They don't want to come on Sunday, that's for sure. So I'm really excited that you're here today.
Merci, Laura, and we'll end this formal portion of the meeting, so you may leave anytime, or you can hang out and talk to Laura for a few minutes. We don't want to keep you too long.